January 17, 1942. The Atlantic Ocean, 600 miles east of Newfoundland. The sea is a shifting, monstrous slab of iron gray, capped by whitecaps like the teeth of a starving wolf. A half-gale howls across the superstructure, coating every lanyard and spar in hoarfrost and thick, punishing ice. The light is weak, metallic, and exhausted, refusing to properly rise above the horizon. Visibility is poor, measured in yards of swirling mist and blinding horizontal snow. In the dead center of the massive convoy, codenamed HX-170, moves a leviathan of steel, the newest expression of American naval power, the USS Washington, hull number BB-56. She is a giant built under the shadow of limiting treaties, fast, well-armed, yet considered by many critics to be a compromise, a vessel of constrained ambition. She moves now not to seek battle, but to shepherd. Her 9 16-inch guns, capable of hurling a projectile weighing more than a sedan over 20 miles, are silent, masked by canvas covers caked in rime. Her mission is patience, endurance, and deterrence. On the bridge, under the flickering glow of a shaded lamp, the air smells of stale coffee, tobacco, and ozone from the primitive, humming radar scopes. A young gunner's mate, no more than 19, shifts his weight against the cold steel of the bulkhead. His mind drifts, not to the submarine threat lurking below, but to the small, hard lump resting in his breast pocket, next to his cigarette pack. It is the American Ration D bar, a block of fortified, heat-resistant chocolate, deliberately made to taste only a little better than a boiled potato to discourage immediate consumption. But to the sailor, it is more than 1,800 calories of emergency survival. It is a direct, tangible link to the incredible, unstoppable, industrial heartland he defends. It is the taste of Hershey, Pennsylvania, a world away from the chilling, hostile gray of the North Atlantic. Historical context. This moment, the grinding, endless patrol of the North Atlantic neutrality zone, is where the story of the Washington truly begins, before the theatrical fire and smoke of the Pacific, before the legend was truly forged. She was not destined for the glory of Pearl Harbor, nor the initial shock of Coral Sea or Midway. Her genesis was born of limitation and a late entry into the global catastrophe. Laid down in 1938, commissioned in May 1941, the Washington and her sister ship, the North Carolina, represented the first battleships the United States had constructed in 2 decades. They were fast battleships designed to accompany the burgeoning carrier fleet, a philosophy that placed speed and modern technology, particularly radar, on equal footing with armor and armament. The world had fractured. Europe was ablaze. By early 1942, Hitler's U-boat wolf packs were tearing through the Atlantic, aiming to sever the vital artery of materiel flowing from the arsenal of democracy to Great Britain and, crucially, to the desperate Soviet ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. The Washington's assignment, as flagship of Rear Admiral John W. Wilcox, was terrifyingly simple. Defend the convoys, and if the German super battleship Tirpitz dared to show its face, meet it and destroy it. This was the cold, unsung cradle of her war service, where the tedious monotony of the endless ocean was punctuated only by the mortal terror of depth charges and the agonizing search for U-boats. The ship was a silent, massive commitment, a promise made in steel that American resources would flow, unbroken, regardless of the cost. This Atlantic deployment, operating out of Scapa Flow alongside the British home fleet, provided the Washington's crew with an education in the realities of total war, lessons that transcended theoretical gunnery practice. They witnessed the agonizing losses of convoy PQ-17, an infamous tragedy where German air and submarine power, combined with a disastrous Admiralty decision to scatter the convoy, led to the destruction of 24 merchant ships. The Washington was nearby, impotent to save them, her crew absorbing the brutal lesson. The enemy was calculating, merciless, and utterly committed to the destruction of the lifeline. For weeks, they sailed through water choked with the wreckage of shattered ships and the bodies of freezing merchant sailors. In this environment of relentless attrition, the American abundance was starkly apparent. While British sailors often subsisted on dried biscuits and tinned corned beef, the Washington crew enjoyed fresh milk, ample meat, and endless supplies of coffee, and yes, that uniquely American product. The ration D-bar, sometimes despised for its waxy, dense texture, was a sign of a supply chain that never faltered, a national capacity that produced not just weapons, but also comfort, consistency, and calories, a quiet, constant affirmation that America's war machine could not be starved out. Emotional contrast, the Pacific pivot. In July 1942, the Washington was recalled, rushed through a refit, and ordered south through the Panama Canal, thrusting her into the blistering, high-stakes chaos of the Pacific War, where the ideology of the American sailor would meet the doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Japanese Navy operated on a doctrine born of spiritual conviction, the Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. Their sailors and commanders, conditioned by decades of intense, ritualistic training, expected naval combat to be a contest of sheer willpower and precision optical sighting. They possessed the finest optical lenses in the world, night fighting skills honed by years of dedication, and the devastating Type 93 long-lance torpedo, a weapon unmatched by any allied nation. The Japanese believed they were fighting an undisciplined, technologically reliant foe, the Americans, whose moral fiber would crack under the pressure of close-range night action. They expected American ships to be timid, their fire control to be imprecise, their commanders reluctant to commit fully. They saw themselves as the spiritual inheritors of naval supremacy, ready to achieve a quick, glorious victory that would shatter the American will. The Japanese sailor's ration, the nigiri, rice ball, and perhaps a piece of dried fish or salted plum, was austere, meant only to fuel duty, not to provide comfort. It was a ration of scarcity, reflecting a nation whose industrial base was finite and whose strategy depended on victory before resources ran out. The Japanese expected their sacrifice to be superior to the enemy's abundance. The reality they were about to face in the suffocating darkness around Guadalcanal was a nightmare of American engineering. They did not meet an undisciplined, hesitant opponent. They met the USS Washington, flagship of Rear Admiral Willis A. Ching Lee, Jr., a brilliant gunnery expert and one of the world's foremost authorities on naval radar. Lee was an officer who understood that the future of naval warfare was not defined by the human eye, but by the cold, calculating precision of the electron. The contrast was absolute. Japanese doctrine relied on the moon, the eye, and the spiritual superiority of the warrior. American reality relied on the S-band SG radar, the FCFD gunnery tracking systems, and the relentless inhuman capacity to generate power, power to drive the ship, power to hurl the shells, and the electrical power to feed the radars that saw where no man could. The Night of the Legend, November 14th-15th, 1942. The place was the waters north of Guadalcanal, an area nicknamed Iron Bottom Sound, for the staggering number of ships, both American and Japanese, that had already sunk there, creating an underwater graveyard. The date was the night of November 14th-15th, 1942. The stakes were nothing less than the destiny of the Pacific War. If the Japanese bombardment force, centered around the fast battleship Kirishima and heavy cruisers, succeeded in shelling Henderson Field, the Marine position on Guadalcanal would be untenable. The Japanese would win the island, and the entire momentum of the war would shift. Admiral Lee's Task Force 64 consisted of the Washington, her sister ship South Dakota, and 4 screening destroyers. They stood between the Japanese and the lifeline of the Marines. The engagement began in utter, disorienting darkness and chaos. The Japanese, using their superior optics, spotted the American destroyers first. The American light screen was immediately savaged by a storm of concentrated Japanese shell fire and the brutal impact of the long-lance torpedoes. The destroyers USS Walk and USS Preston were obliterated almost instantly. USS Benham was fatally damaged. The cost was immediate and horrendous. Then disaster struck the Washington's partner. The South Dakota, struggling with an electrical malfunction that had rendered its radar and much of its fire control useless, inadvertently steamed into the east full glare of the Japanese searchlights. The South Dakota, crippled and silhouetted, became the magnificent, tragic decoy, absorbing a hail of shells from the Japanese cruisers and the Kirishima herself. The South Dakota was shot up, her superstructure a ruin of buckled steel and electrical short circuits. Meanwhile, the Washington, the silent, unseen Leviathan, had successfully avoided the chaos. Admiral Lee and his crew watched the entire brutal drama unfold on their radar scopes. They saw the friendly ships vanish, the South Dakota light up like a catastrophic Christmas tree, and, most critically, they watched the Japanese force converge and focus their attention on the burning target. The Washington was running dark, her superior SG radar painting a perfect clinical picture of the enemy formation. The Japanese, confident in their night-fighting prowess and focused entirely on the wounded South Dakota, remained completely unaware that the most powerful naval gun platform in the world was maneuvering just 8,400 yards away, an unblinking, unseen eye in the darkness. Historical evidence. The 7 minutes of fury at 01, Admiral Lee gave the command. The Washington was cleared to fire. Sound of deep, resonant crack, followed by a terrifying, prolonged rush of air and a heavy, repeating thud. The effect was instantaneous and shocking. In the space of 7 minutes, the Washington unleashed an utterly devastating barrage. 75 rounds of its 9 16-inch Mark VI shells, each weighing 2,700 pounds, smashed into the Imperial Japanese battleship Kirishima. Simultaneously, her secondary battery hurled over 100 5-inch shells, turning the darkness into a blinding, calculated storm. This was not a duel of visual sighting, it was an execution by technology. The Japanese gunners were adjusting their optics to the muzzle flashes of the South Dakota when the invisible hammer of the Washington fell upon them. Historical records confirm the surgical precision. Time of engagement, 7 minutes. Range, as close as 8,400 yards, less than 5 miles. Point-blank range for a battleship. Hits, at least 9, and likely more, of the Washington's 16-inch shells struck Kirishima's hull, below the waterline, in the engine room, and in the after steering gear. Outcome: the Japanese battleship, a converted battlecruiser, was fatally crippled. Steering jammed, her main battery turrets were put out of action, and uncontrolled flooding began immediately. The official report dryly noted the outcome, a testament to technological superiority. Washington's accurate fire mortally injured Kirishima. Set aflame and racked by explosions, Kirishima was scuttled by her crew. The Japanese had gambled their doctrine of optical supremacy against American radar, and they had lost everything. The shock was profound. Japanese naval commanders, after the battle, could not reconcile the American precision with their expected performance. They could not understand how a ship they did not see, whose guns they did not register, could deliver such perfect, paralyzing blows. It was the first, last, and only time an American fast battleship engaged and sank an enemy capital ship in a one-on-one surface action in the Pacific War. In the brief, terrifying lull after the main action, as the Kirishima burned in the distance, a junior officer on the Washington's bridge quietly reached into his pocket and offered his ration D bar to a visibly shaking radar operator. The bar, hard, bland, and almost flavorless, was a stark contrast to the horrific violence that had just erupted. It was a mundane symbol of the safety and normalcy that American industrial supremacy provided, a pocket-sized reminder that the complex, life-saving machine they commanded was backed by a nation of limitless production and material comfort, a nation that could afford to send thousands of tons of chocolate, not just shells, across the ocean. Transformation, from compromise to custodian. The Battle of Guadalcanal marked the definitive transformation of the USS Washington's identity. She ceased to be the treaty compromise ship of the North Atlantic and became, overnight, a silent legend, the guardian who stood firm when all others fell. She was proof that American technological innovation, when coupled with focused training, could shatter the enemy's most cherished doctrine. Admiral Lee, often called Ching for his piercing, analytical mind, retired to a sea cabin not with shouts of victory, but with the calm satisfaction of a scientist whose experiment had proven correct. The battle was not one of bravado, but of data processing. The ship, with her sophisticated radar array, had simply executed the ultimate firing solution. The transformation was also deeply personal for the crew. They had faced the legendary Long Lance and the feared Japanese night-fighting expertise, and they had survived, completely unscathed by enemy fire. This remarkable distinction, the only fast U.S. battleship to never lose a man to hostile action, would become the hallmark of the Washington's career. Her men developed a fierce, almost superstitious belief in the ship's luck and her prowess. They viewed themselves not merely as sailors, but as custodians of a devastating secret weapon, the marriage of American industrial might, the 16-inch gun, and American scientific genius, the SG radar. Throughout 1943 and 1944, the Washington served as the vital screen and guardian of the fast carrier task forces, the spearhead of the relentless American push across the Central Pacific. Carriers like the Enterprise and Yorktown relied completely on her speed, her heavy armor, and her unrivaled anti-aircraft battery to shield them from Japanese aircraft attacks. She was there at the invasions of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, Tarawa, Kwajalein, and Eniwetok. Her 16-inch shells hammered concrete pillboxes and blasted jungle defenses, pulverizing the Japanese expectation that fixed island fortifications could withstand the industrial weight of American heavy artillery. It was during the endless, grinding work of the Central Pacific Drive that the contrast with the enemy became most visceral. When American forces finally broke through the outer defenses of a fortified island, they inevitably discovered Japanese garrisons that were starving, diseased, and low on ammunition. Their rations were meager, a thin gruel of rice or often nothing at all, a final reflection of the collapsing Japanese supply chain. In contrast, the American sailor, after a day of continuous combat air patrol or shore bombardment, would return to a mess deck where ice cream was available, where hot chow was prepared daily, and where the ever-present ration D bar, now perhaps the slightly better-tasting tropical bar variant, was still issued as a standard piece of equipment. The sheer logistics required to keep the Washington and her task force supplied, with thousands of tons of fuel, water, and specialized ordnance, plus an endless stream of mundane, morale-boosting items, represented the true, insurmountable strategic advantage of the United States. The chocolate bar was the physical, sugary manifestation of this abundance, something the Japanese, operating on austerity and spiritual fervor, could never match. The Great Marianas, Turkey Shoot, and beyond. The Washington sailed through the biggest naval engagements of the war, though her role had changed from surface duelist to guardian of the carrier fleet. In June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by elated American pilots, The Washington's sophisticated anti-aircraft array was pivotal. The ship, now heavily augmented with Bofor's 40mm and Oerlikon 20mm cannons, was a floating wall of flak. Japanese pilots, trained in the ideology of glorious, sacrificial attack, flew into skies that were literally black with American defensive fire. They expected to pierce the screen and strike the carriers. Instead, they were intercepted by waves of Hellcats and then greeted by a storm of shells from ships like the Washington. The sound of the ship's 5-inch guns barking anti-aircraft barrages, coordinated by radar, was a terrifying music of destruction. Sound of continuous rapid-fire anti-aircraft cannons, a deafening, metallic drumbeat. The Japanese flyers, witnessing the sheer scale and density of the American defense, the endless stream of fighter planes, the precision of the radar-directed flak, suffered not just tactical losses, but an ideological collapse. The American war machine was not merely stronger, it was overwhelming. The Washington continued its march westward, supporting the invasions of Peleliu, Leyte, and Luzon. Her armor shook from the recoil of her main battery as she pulverized defenses for Iwo Jima and Okinawa. She became, to her crew, an invincible fortress. The fact that the ship's toughest battle damage came not from the enemy, but from a collision with her sister ship, the USS Indiana, in the darkness of February 1944, a collision that necessitated a major bow replacement at Puget Sound, only underscored her remarkable immunity to enemy fire. By the end of the war, the USS Washington had earned 13 battle stars. She had steamed from the Arctic Circle to the South China Sea. She had faced U-boats, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and hundreds of aircraft. She had delivered crushing fire against every major Japanese objective in the Central Pacific. And yet, she returned home having never taken a single fatal hit from the enemy. Epilogue: sound of gentle waves, distant bugle playing taps. The war ended, not with the heroic flourish of a final surface duel, but with the exhaustion of empires. The USS Washington, the ship that was supposed to be a treaty compromise, sailed through the Panama Canal one last time, west to east, to serve her final duty, transporting veteran troops home from the European theater. She was the silent sentinel, now carrying the human cargo of victory. In June 1947, she was decommissioned, struck from the Naval Register in 1960, and sold for scrap in 1961. The steel that had withstood the Atlantic gales and the hellfire of Iron Bottom Sound was melted down, returning to the Earth's elements, perhaps to be reformed into the steel girders of a skyscraper or the chassis of a truck. The very abundance she once defended. The great ships, the titans of the sea, are gone. The steel is dispersed. But the legend of the Washington endures, silent and profound. She was the physical manifestation of a truth the Axis powers fundamentally misunderstood, that the true measure of military might is not derived from fanaticism or spiritual sacrifice, but from the industrial foundation that underpins a free society. The chocolate bar, that small, unappetizing, high-calorie block of Hershey's ration, was the key. The ability of the American system to simultaneously produce overwhelming firepower, develop revolutionary technologies like radar, and maintain an unbroken supply of even the most mundane comforts speaks to a depth of resource and an efficiency of spirit that no ideology of scarcity could overcome. The American sailor fought not just for a flag, but for a nation that could deliver the world's most advanced battleship and an endless supply of chocolate to the farthest reaches of the globe. The Washington was a vessel that embodied this democratic industrial abundance. She was fast, functional, and efficient. Her victory over the Kirishima was the ultimate demonstration that the machine that provided 1,000 comforts to its crew was also the machine capable of delivering absolute, calculated destruction to its enemy. The legacy of the silent legend is this: the fight for freedom is never fought by spirit alone. It is fought by the willingness of a society to harness its every resource, its science, its industry, its wealth, to protect its way of life, ensuring that every soldier and sailor in the darkest, coldest corner of the world carried in his breast pocket not a symbol of sacrifice, but a small, hard, reassuring taste of home. And that, in the long account of total war, was the truly decisive advantage.